The Inquisitor, from Pamiers to the throne. Jacques Fournier's rise to the papacy was not the product of political maneuvering or aristocratic connection. It was the product of a reputation for methodical, relentless precision. As Bishop of Pamiers in the foothills of the Pyrenees, he spent the years between 1318 and 1325 conducting a systematic inquisition against the last surviving communities of Cathars in the village of Montella and the surrounding region. What distinguished his inquisition from many others of the period was not its brutality, it was, by the standards of the time, relatively restrained, but its extraordinary documentary rigor. Fournier personally interrogated hundreds of men and women, recording their testimony in extraordinary detail. The result was the Register of Jacques Fournier. A document of more than 500 interrogations, running to thousands of pages, that preserved the daily life, beliefs, fears, and social relationships of a rural Pyrenean community in the early 14th century with an intimacy that no other source of the period approaches. The historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie used this register as the foundation for his celebrated book Montella, a reconstruction of medieval peasant life so vivid that it reads almost like a novel. The register exists because Fournier believed that every word mattered, that ambiguity was a form of failure, and that the truth, properly pursued, would always yield to a sufficiently patient and systematic inquiry. These convictions would define his entire career. In 1317 he became Bishop of Pamiers, and in 1326 was transferred to the more prestigious see of Mirepoix. In 1327 he was elevated to cardinal. When the conclave assembled in Avignon in December 1334 to elect a successor to Pope John XXI, it was deadlocked for 3 weeks. Fournier was not the obvious candidate, he was an outsider, without the courtly polish or the political networks of the leading contenders. He was elected on the 24th of December, after the other factions exhausted their alternatives, and took the name Benedict XII. His reaction, according to those present, was to express immediate reluctance. He may have been sincere. The Avignon builder, architecture as theology. Benedict XII is credited with beginning the construction of the Palais des Papes, the Palace of the Popes, in Avignon, which remains one of the largest Gothic buildings in Europe and the defining monument of the Avignon papacy. The section he built, known as the Old Palace, is a revealing document of his personality. It is massive, austere, and almost entirely free of ornamental excess. The walls are thick, the towers severe, the interior spaces functional rather than decorative. It is the architecture of a man who believed that the purpose of a building was to serve a purpose, and that anything beyond that was a distraction. This aesthetic austerity was matched by administrative reform. Benedict XII inherited a papal court bloated by nepotism, personal favoritism, and the kind of casual corruption that accumulates in any institution over time. His response was systematic. He reduced the papal household, dismissed officials who had been appointed on the basis of connection rather than competence, and implemented reforms across the major religious orders, the Benedictines, the Cistercians, the Franciscans, and the Dominicans, that were intended to return them to stricter observance of their founding rules. These reforms generated fierce resistance. The religious orders were powerful institutions with their own interests, and they did not welcome the scrutiny of a pope who had spent his career interrogating people for a living. Benedict pressed ahead regardless. He also maintained a consistent and largely unsuccessful effort to remain neutral in the conflict between France and England that would eventually become the 100 Years' War. The French crown exerted constant pressure on the Avignon papacy to take its side. Edward III of England applied counter-pressure from the other direction. Benedict refused both, to the frustration of both parties, a diplomatic position that required considerable personal resolve in an institution that had been politically subordinate to France for decades. The theology of fixity, Benedictus Deus. The most significant, and most contested, intellectual act of Benedict XII's pontificate was the promulgation of the bull Benedictus Deus in January 1336. The issue it addressed had been simmering for decades and had reached a crisis point under his predecessor, John XXII, who had advanced the heterodox opinion that the souls of the dead did not experience the full beatific vision, the direct sight of God, until after the Last Judgment. This position implied that the faithful departed existed in a kind of intermediate state between death and the final resurrection, which had profound implications for the theology of prayer, purgatory, indulgences, and the intercession of saints. John XXII had preached this view in public sermons, and the resulting controversy had been intense. Benedict XII resolved it definitively. Benedictus Deus declared, as a matter of defined Catholic doctrine, that souls who are fully purified do indeed behold the divine essence directly and immediately after death, without waiting for the resurrection of the body or the last judgment. It was a statement of theological precision in a domain that had been left deliberately vague for centuries, and it required a willingness to close a question that many in the Church had found it more comfortable to leave open. It was, in every sense, consistent with the man who had produced the Register of Peasants, a mind that could not rest with ambiguity and believed that the most charitable thing one could do for human beings was to tell them, as clearly as possible, what was true. The Register and the Historians, an accidental masterpiece. The Register of Jacques Fournier would almost certainly have remained an obscure archival document, consulted by specialists and forgotten by everyone else, had it not been for the French historian Emmanuel Leroy-Ladurie. In 1975, Leroy-Ladurie published Montaigne, The Promised Land of Error, a reconstruction of daily life in a small Pyrenean village in the early 14th century, drawn almost entirely from Fournier's interrogation records. The book became an international sensation, translated into dozens of languages and read by millions of people who had no particular interest in medieval theology or Cathar heresy. What they found in it was something far more immediate, the voices of ordinary people talking about their lives, their loves, their feuds, their fears, their beliefs about the afterlife, their opinions of their neighbors, their experiences of hunger and illness and desire. Preserved in a detail that no chronicle, no court record, and no literary source of the period could match. Leroy-Ladurie called Fournier's Register a unique document in the history of the Western world. He was not exaggerating. The Inquisitor's obsessive insistence on recording every word, every hesitation, every contradiction in the testimony of shepherds and weavers and village priests had produced, by accident, the most intimate portrait of medieval European peasant life that exists. The people Fournier interrogated had no idea they were contributing to a historical record. They were trying to survive an interrogation. But because Fournier believed that every detail might be theologically significant, that the precise way a man described his neighbor's attitude toward the Eucharist might reveal something about his own heresy, he preserved those details. And those details are now irreplaceable. For modern historians, the Fournier Register is not primarily a document about the Cathar heresy. It is a document about how people actually lived in the 14th century, what they ate, where they slept, how they understood death, what they thought about God, and how they talked to each other when they believed no one important was listening. That it was created by an inquisitor, by a man conducting a procedure designed to identify and punish religious deviance, is one of the great ironies of medieval historiography. Fournier wanted to eliminate ambiguity. In doing so, he preserved it in extraordinary abundance. The legacy of an uncomfortable man. Benedict XII died in April 1342, after less than 8 years as pope. He was succeeded by Clement VI, who promptly reversed much of his administrative austerity, expanded the papal court, and pursued a pontificate of ostentatious generosity that was far more popular with the cardinals and the French crown. The contrast between the two men was striking enough to become a kind of shorthand in medieval commentary. Clement VI was said to have declared that his predecessor had not known how to be pope. By which he meant, presumably, that Benedict had not understood that the papacy was also a performance, a spectacle, a mechanism for generating loyalty and awe through display. In this, Clement was probably right. Benedict XII had no interest in spectacle. He was interested in function. Whether this made him a great pope is a question historians continue to debate. The reforms he implemented in the religious orders had limited long-term effect. The institutions he tried to discipline reverted to their old habits within a generation. Benedictus Deus endured as a binding definition of Catholic doctrine. The palace of the popes endured as a monument, though it was completed and embellished by his successors in ways he would almost certainly have found excessive. And the Register of Jacques Fournier endured as an accidental masterpiece, a byproduct of persecution that became, centuries later, one of the most intimate windows into the life of ordinary people in medieval Europe. What endures most persistently about Benedict XII is perhaps the image of a man who believed, against the evidence of his entire era, that institutions could be made to function as they were supposed to function. That the gap between what an organization claimed to be and what it actually was could be closed by the application of sufficient will, sufficient precision, and sufficient patience. He was wrong, in the short term. He may not have been wrong about the principle.